On today's episode, we have on Miss Beth Macy. She has written Dopesick, Raising Lazarus, and Factory Man, among other stuff. Miss Macy, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you guys?
We're
Doing
doing
well.
good. I think I can speak for both me and Ethan when I say we're very excited to have you on.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
We always start out our episodes with the same question, and that is, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Urbana, Ohio, which is a small town that kind of reminded me of Mount Airy a bit.
Were you very academic in school?
I was. I grew up really poor, but I went to really good schools, and I had all kinds of friends, including ministers' children and doctors' sons, and it was kind of a small town. I think unlike in a city, you meet all kinds of people, right? And so I had so many opportunities that I don't think I would have had if I had grown up poor in a bigger place. And I was the first person in my family to go to college, which has had a huge impact on pretty much 80% of what I've written in these 35 years. So I'm actually writing a book about that now. So
Oh, wow. Okay.
Was there an educator during your time in school that really had a deep effect on you?
That can be in college, high school, even
Yes, ma'am.
elementary school.
yeah, there were many. I had really good English teachers who brought like literature and poetry alive. Uh, I remember having to memorize poetry, which sounds kind of out of fashion and boring today, but it like made a huge impact on me.
Yeah.
And I loved the library, which was right down the street from my house. I could walk to it. My parents were huge library users. And, I knew everybody in the town. I delivered the newspaper after school. I had an afternoon route, and which taught me like discipline. And then I played in the band. I played the cornet or trumpet in the band. And my band director was this kind of old guy close to retirement who had worked in the school since like way before I was born. And he was kind of a father figure to me, even though he was kind of stern. You always knew he was watching out for you. And that really, it made me want to please him. It made me want to do well, and taught me a lot of leadership.
Did you ever want to pursue a career in music?
No, but I have a musician son, so
Okay.
it's still getting out there.
It's full circle.
music.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's actually part of an Appalachian string band called Palmyra.
Okay. Interesting.
Did you show a strong disposition for writing very early on, or was that something that you developed later?
Yeah, I really liked all my English teachers, and I kind of did the best in English and band. And I didn't think I was good enough to play band in college, but that was probably a mistake. I should have. But I picked journalism, and I loved it immediately because I really like talking to all kinds of people. I love talking to strangers, and no day was like another day. It was always interesting.
Right,
You never knew what you're going to be doing. I mean, that's still the case today. Although I go out and I gather a bunch of information, and then I come home and like this week, I'm just writing at my desk. But so that's somewhat similar, but I really like that it's both like introverted in that you're writing here and thinking hard, and then it's extroverted in that you get to go out and meet all kinds of people, and then come back to this quiet place and try to tell other people what you're learning.
Yeah.
You were the first person in your family to go to college. Can you walk us through what that process was like, deciding to go to college and then eventually going?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. It was huge. I didn't think I'd be able to go because we had no money. My dad was kind of the town drunk. By the time I came along, I was the youngest by far of four kids. So I was much younger than the rest. And it was kind of like I was an only child. and my dad was kind of in a late stage of alcoholism by then, and my mom like kept everything together. And I just didn't think I was going to be able to go, but I had really good grades. I had like, I don't know, 3-4 or something. I was in the honor roll. I was 20th in my class. And a guidance counselor took me aside, like, I think it was senior year, and said, there's this thing called Pell Grants, which is federal financial aid, which is based on your income. And he said, I'm sure you can get one. And I was just flabbergasted when the statement came back after I did the FAFSA. And like, I was in this brief window of opportunity in the nation when a poor kid could go to college and the whole thing was free. And very shortly after I graduated in 1986, that window closed. Now, if you're poor, you can still get a Pell Grant, but it's only going to pay about 30%. So somebody like me, I wouldn't have even considered that. I wouldn't have had the confidence to think I could take out a bunch of loans. I just wouldn't have. My mom wouldn't have signed for it. She would have been too scared.
Yeah.
It was just a different time. But I'm writing about that in my new book now, which is sort of writing about the changes that have happened since I left my hometown 40 years ago and what it's like for poor kids today.
Do you mind telling us the name of your new book, or is that top secret information?
No, it's called Paper Girl. I think I told you I covered the paper, and then I wrote for papers for many, many years. And it's going to talk about the inequality and the barriers that poor kids face. But I'm telling it through kind of a young me who is a kid who grew up and was recommended by almost everyone I met as a super promising kid. And he was actually homeless his junior and senior year, couch surfing, etc. And while he was the drum major or the leader of the band at the same time. So I was like, yeah. And had lost a parent to an opioid overdose, other parent in and out of jail. And this kid, as my mom told me once, you have practically raised yourself. This kid totally raised himself.
Yeah.
And so I'm writing about kind of the shifts that have happened in terms of growing inequality, but also how we've gotten polarized as a nation. So I'm also digging into that.
And are you in the early stages of the writing process, or are you pretty far into the novel?
I'm on page. I'm about a third of the way through. I'm on page 89 as we speak. Aiming for about 350 on a Word doc.
I gotcha. Yeah. Well, that's really cool. Me and Ethan are both big readers.
Yes, we are. I see books in the back. Right? Not all of those are ours, but
and we've interviewed some writers before, and we always ask what books they enjoyed growing up, or what books had a great impact on them. If you'd like to speak to that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I love that question. The first book that just lit me up, I was in the 4th grade, was a novel called Harriet the Spy. Have you heard of that?
Okay.
Okay.
By this, they made it like a kids movie out of it a few years ago, but it's a book about this girl. She's in Manhattan. It's in the Wayback Machine, probably in the 50s, and she is kind of an introvert, but she likes to spy on people, and she takes notes, and she's kind of like a reporter, and it kind of comes back to bite her on the butt. But it was just a great story about a young girl who like had her own vision and her way of looking at the world that wasn't that common. You didn't see many like really strong young women characters when I was young. And so that made a big impact on me. When I moved to Roanoke to write for the Roanoke Times in 1989, I was a feature writer, and I would interview a lot of writers when they came through, or people who were from here. And I remember interviewing the novelist Lee Smith, who's from far Southwest Virginia and has written a bunch of novels. And she said something, she had gone away to boarding school. Her daddy ran the dime store in the little town of Grundy, Virginia. And she said when she first went to college at Hollins, in the 60s, she thought that she had to try to be fancy like her fellow students, but she realized that her writing only came alive when she wrote like the women in her family back home spoke.
Mhm.
And so, like that helped her find her voice. And that's when her most authentic work really came to life. And that really just kind of stuck with me. And I think I was about 10 years into newspaper writing when I realized that my best stories were always the ones about outsiders and underdogs. I just cared more about them. I cared more. It scratched a social justice itch that I had. That when you're first starting out, you just do what they tell you to do, and you've got to. But after you get a little bit of seniority and your editors start to trust you, I always reasoned that if I had a ton of great story ideas, like they wouldn't give me the stupid ideas, that they came up with.
Yeah.
So that was what I did. And my favorite story I ever wrote in my whole life was a story of this young woman who grew up here in Roanoke, raised in the projects by a single mom. And she wasn't just the first in her family to go. She was the first in that neighborhood to go.
Oh,
And,
wow.
and she went to Harvard.
Wow.
I mean, you can find a better story than that.
Yeah.
It still makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck. And
Yeah.
she was raised by this predominantly African American library that was the Black library during segregation and is now a branch library. And I had been there doing some research maybe a year or 2 years before she graduated from high school. And the librarian said, "You got to watch out for this girl. She's going to be something." And so I would just check in with her every now and then. And so I actually happened to be there the day she found out. I mean, she got into every college she applied for. But when she, checks her email at 5 p.m. on May 1st or whatever the day was, she started screaming and the whole library erupted. And people who were there, who had known her since she was little, um, like burst into tears. Old men were weeping. I mean, for the history that she was about to represent for them.
Right.
And so when any story I'm working on or any book, when the narrative intersects with my values, my
Yeah.
being pissed off about inequality, my being pissed off about racism, my being pissed off about an 87% treatment gap for people with opioid use disorder, many of whom got it through no fault of their own, but because through a prescription pad pushed by people like Purdue, then that's what lights my brain up.
Right.
But it took me a while to discover that.
Was majoring in journalism a conscious choice due to your proficiency in writing and love of English class?
Mm-hmm.
Or was it kind of just a shot in the dark? I might enjoy this.
I don't quite remember. I think it was like, yeah, I think I just realized like I wouldn't have mind being a teacher. I used to have a huge public speaking phobia, but I thought I could handle talking to people one-on-one. I mean, now like part of how I make my living now is speaking in public, which is funny, which is also a lesson. Like you can get over a fear you have if you do it enough, right?
Yeah.
I think it was part of both. Yeah.
You mentioned that you were the first person in your family to go to school. What was your college experience like? Did you enjoy it? Were you involved in any clubs or activities?
I felt like a real fish out of water. I was from a small town. I went to Bowling Green State University, which is up near Toledo. A lot of people from Cleveland, a lot of kind of city folks. I'm still really good friends with some of the people I went to college with, but I wouldn't say I enjoyed it. I think I did like a pep band one year. I played on the racquetball team. It was like a club team. I joined a sorority for a brief foray into that world. But mostly, I was really serious about school. I knew I was lucky to be there. And like, I can remember it was almost a blizzard. There was so much snow on the ground and I didn't have snow boots and but I have a journalism class, and I walk from my dorm all the way to campus, all the way to the journalism building one day. And anyone in their right mind would have gone, oh, the classes are probably closed because there's snow on the ground. And when I got there, like the door was locked. There were no classes, but like I never missed a class. You know what I mean? Like I should have just like asked my RA. This is before the internet and all that. Nobody else went to that building that day but me. But because I was not messing around. I was going to take advantage of this gift I had been given.
I read an article on you written by someone at Bowling Green State University. I apologize. And you mentioned that one of the most influential professors you ever had was a Dr. Ray
Lockanimi.
His last name was very
Lockanimi.
His last name is very difficult to pronounce. But you mentioned that he taught you how to interview. Can you elaborate on what you meant?
Yeah, so he was like my introduction to journalism professor, and we would he'd bring strangers in and we'd practice interviewing them almost like we were at a press conference or something. And then he'd have us interview each other, and then he would give us assignments. I remember the first person that I didn't know was the chief of police in Bowling Green, because I had a work study job where I worked in financial aid and my boss was married to him. So it was like, very intimidating interviewing strangers at the beginning, even though it's like my favorite thing to do now. But there's still like a moment when you're calling up a stranger when you still get like nervous, and then, and depending on who it is, you have to do a lot of prep for it. But basically what he taught me was just have a conversation, have your list of questions, but also just be willing to let it go where it leads. And oftentimes when you get to at the end, I always ask at the end, what did I forget to ask you? I put the onus on me. What did I forget to ask you? Or is there anything else you want to say? Chances are when I look at my questions, they've been answered just in the course of this like friendly conversation in which my only goal is to be curious, especially the first time I interview somebody. I interview people many, many times.
Well, sometimes that's what it takes, and you obviously were very successful.
Yeah, it's story. It is challenging reaching out to people that you don't really have, or that you've never really met before. So that's a really good skill to learn.
Yeah.
Just like y'all, until you have some questions written down, right? You did your homework. Exactly. You read this piece about Doc Lockanimi. I mean, that is deep in the archives. So I appreciate that. And that's the thing too. People know you're serious when you do your homework, right? They know you're serious. I'm not just like when I wrote Factory Man, which was my first book, which is set in Galax, not too far from you. By the time I got around to interviewing the CEO of Bassett Furniture, I'd probably talked to 30 people in the town. I knew his whole family tree. I knew so much about his family and the company he ran. Because I tend to start with the people on the ground. I talk to the people who lost their jobs, the people who worked for them, the janitor, the EMS guy, the babysitter. I really think it's important to start, if you're doing something that involves a hierarchy or wealth and poverty, it's really important to start with the people on the ground, I think. And then I'll work my way up. And I'll just ask better questions.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. How do you approach interviewing someone who doesn't want to be interviewed? Because we've experienced that. We'll ask people, hey, can we interview you? Can we tell your story?
Yeah, and a lot of times
they don't want to. No. They don't want to.
And we respect that, but it is.
Of course. It's frustrating at times.
Yeah, it's always easier if you have an entree, like if you have an intermediary that can vouch for you. Like the first time I went down to Mount Airy for Raising Lazarus, which is my follow-up book about solutions to the opioid crisis, my follow-up to Dopesick, I was really going down there to meet somebody named Michelle Mathis, who is based in Hickory, but she had brought in to advise the folks in Mount Airy who were trying to help people navigate treatment options. And that's when I met Mark Willis. That's when I met Jamie Edwards, your dad. And like if I had just walked in cold without Michelle there to introduce me, it might have taken them a while to trust me. As it was, I had already given a talk down at Surrey County before, and so Mark already knew who I was. But yeah, sure. When I was starting out, um, I I I try to find what I call story beacons, and these are people who might not be the story, but they are connected to a lot of different people, and they will get you to the other stories. Like that librarian I mentioned earlier. She's the one that got me to Selena. At the time, she was helping me with another story. And so, one of the best places I find stories is from stories I've already done, from meeting people on other stories, and that several conversations with them. And then along the way, I always say, well, what else is going on that you know about that you think might be interesting? And then that person can vouch for you, send an email or call somebody. I mean, that is a technique I have relied upon over and over and over. And then usually, once you can get that first interview, then they get how serious you are. You know what I mean?
Right.
And then you can
Yeah.
follow up. And I always tell students, if the phone call wasn't great, like meet them in person next time, send them an email, send them a text. You have to figure out which way they prefer to communicate, because some people are very buttoned up when you're talking to them, but they'll text you anything. And so it's like, you have to just kind of feel people out if you have the time.
Yeah, when you sense that somebody's going to be hesitant to speak with you, you have some opening questions that you ask them to kind of build that rapport.
Um, Well, I'll usually have the idea what the story is before I call them. So I'll have like a broad, well, I've already have discussed it before we meet, kind of what the frame of the story is. But if I sense that they're nervous or they don't want to answer a question, I'll just flat out ask. I'll say, what is it you're concerned about? Um, and like oftentimes it's not even anything I was going to include. Do you know what I mean? And so that, um, there shouldn't be any huge surprises. So if it is something I want to write about, then I'll negotiate, because I always want to serve the reader and serve the broader truth. So if somebody's going to be really difficult and I know I'm not to get the broader truth, I'm going to find somebody else that will get me there. I'm not going to waste my time like hitting my head against a wall. If somebody really doesn't want to be interviewed, but in the work that I do, I'm typically interviewing when I'm talking about people on the ground. I'm interviewing people who have never been interviewed before, and they're usually really open, because people don't listen to people, right? Uh, 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 if you have a holy curiosity about someone, a genuine curiosity, and you're a good listener, people will talk to you.
We found that to be true, certainly.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And sometimes
So
you
maybe
can
just
almost
work on
tell.
those story beacons. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true.
Sometimes you can tell when an interview's not going to go the way you thought it was going to go.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can sense there's an energy that's off. Do you feel that too sometimes when you're talking to
Oh yeah,
someone?
yeah, for sure. Um, yeah, but typically, if I just keep talking and I just bumble and stumble around, people will, you forget you're doing an interview because you're just focused on having a conversation. I'm also usually, if it's on the phone, I'm typing and I'm trying to keep up. If it's in person, I'm recording, but I'm also taking notes. And, but I'm just really, really interested in what they have to say. I mean, that's the key. And I don't think, like, I've worked with people who just, like, you can tell they didn't really care about what they were writing about. That's why it's so important to have things you're really passionate about. And even if you have to do this other stuff because your boss tells you, at least have one thing you're piecing out in between that you really care about.
Yeah.
Of course.
How is interviewing for the newspaper different from interviewing for your own personal books?
Um, Not really that different. The big difference is that with the newspaper, and I was lucky, I got to do a lot of long form stuff and, sometimes spend a month or 2 months or even 3 on a project. Now I spend a year to 2 years on a book. And so if you're going to be like one of my main kind of story subjects, I'm going to spend a lot of time with you. And so I don't try to do a whole bunch the first time. I try to get them comfortable with me and me with them. And then I just go back and I go back and I go back over time, right? So like this young man I told you about earlier, his name's Silas that I'm following now. I first interviewed him over the phone in January, and I talked to him yesterday again over the phone. That was probably the 12th time I've talked to him. I'll probably talk to him 15 more times because the book isn't due until the March after next. So I always have this like running narrative of what's been happening in his life. So I have many, many things to ask him about based on what we talked about last time. And, I don't call him every week even. Like sometimes we just talk once a month. But when I go to visit Ohio, I try to see him every time.
But from reading Dopesick, we can kind of tell that you develop a connection with people that you interview,
yes,
especially in long form.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that, getting to really know somebody and building that
connection, really,
connection
relationship?
With the person?
Yeah. Well, it's like I say, it's got to be authentic. And like in Dopesick, I had written a series for the paper about what we then called the heroin epidemic. And I met a prosecutor then that when I was first casting about to turn the series into a book, I went back to him and he told me the story about this like criminal enterprise that he had just put, I don't know, 6 to 8 people in jail, including a person who was what he said was the largest drug dealer in Virginia. And it was this big sprawling case. He had a big chart. And he didn't really want to talk about the chart to me, but I just kept coaxing him. And at the top of the chart, he named the case FUBI. I don't know if you remember that from the book.
Yes.
I think I called one of the chapters that. But it's kind of funny, like he wouldn't tell me what the FUBI stood for. And I kept circling back because I knew it was good. It was basically the big drug dealers at the top. At the bottom are all the users, and a lot of the names are crossed out because they're dead. In the middle are the middlemen, a lot of whom are also addicted. Some of them are dead. And he was interviewing somebody in the middle once, trying to get him to flip on the top drug dealer to say who he was. That's how they get people. And he said to this guy he was interviewing, he said, tell me who it is. If you don't tell me, I'm going to come back and I'm going to bring charges. Like the guy was already in jail for a lesser charge. And the guy said, F you, bring it. Like bring the charges. I'm not telling. And that was just like, whoo, that was an amazing story. But he didn't give it to me on the record. He's like, I'll tell you, but you can't put it in. Well, I knew the guy's name. When I got home, I found him in a federal prison in North Carolina. And I wrote to him to ask him if we could correspond on the prison's email system. And he was a great source because he knew everybody in that pyramid that was on the chart. And he was willing to tell me like how he had gotten to this point in his life where he's in federal prison. And, and he had been in and out of jail most of his adult life. And then he told me the Fubi story. So then I had it from him. So I totally had it, but that sounds like I was trying to trick the first guy. It wasn't. I was just like following the threads. Do you know what I mean? I never attributed that to him because I had it from another source. So sometimes you have to do that and it's not playing hardball. It's just like turning over every stone.
Persistent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you ever feel like you become so interested in a single person or a single story that you could write a book about that or be interested in doing something like that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
A biography, maybe.
Something like that.
Oh,
A
yeah.
piece of work.
I mean, I'd love to write a story or book or a screenplay on that young woman who went to Harvard because she's amazing. Like, she was raised by the library and she's basically running a library now. Just cool, right? Like a feel good thing. In my world, you kind of get buttoned into one category. Like, everybody in New York thinks I write about really serious things. It's like, what if I wanted to write a cookbook? I could write a cookbook. Do you know what I mean? Like, so I don't get to just write about whatever I want to write about. Alas, I have to figure out a way to sell it, which is sometimes really tricky. I have a really smart, tough agent who like makes me work and rework my book proposals.
Yeah, you mentioned the due date. What's that like working on a long-term project that has a specific, maybe not a specific day, but around
Yeah, I mean,
a quarter, maybe?
yeah, you hear
a
a
due
lot
date.
about authors, their writing process, if they have a page number they want to hit every day, or if they just write when they feel like it. What is that process like for you?
Well, this is funny. I still keep a paper calendar, and every day I tally up my word count at the end of the day, and I put it in another color. So, like, that says 24,761. That was my word count yesterday. I haven't measured yet today. The one before was 23,691. Like, that's a pretty
Wow.
good day. Like, 1,000 words
Yeah,
is,
no kidding.
but some days I have like negative words because I go back and read what I wrote the day before and it's crap, and I'm just delete, delete, delete. And some writing is just, some days it just flows really good. Other times it's just pulling teeth. And what I'll often do, like right now in my book, I'm doing a digression into the history of my hometown, and I'm writing about, like, it was a really big haven on the Underground Railroad, and now it's a town that has Confederate flags. I mean, it has a Union soldier in the middle of the town square facing north. I mean, they lost an outrageous number of people who served in the Union Army were killed in it, and and it was, and it just turns out, and I didn't really know this until I started doing this research, but like the eastern part of the county was very abolitionist, but the western part, the part closer to Indiana, was pro-slavery, and so it was just a really interesting
Yeah.
place. But the Underground Railroad stuff, which I'm just fascinated by.
Yeah.
I mean, all the stuff over on that side that was happening, like Ohio was a hotbed for the Underground Railroad because once you got across the Ohio River from Kentucky, which was been a slave state, and then you could get somebody to Lake Erie in Canada, you were free. But it was against the law, so it was very secretive. But there are just some great stories deep in the archives that I never learned growing up about the risks black and white people took to help runaway slaves. But that kind of writing, even though I'm really into it, it's very hard because you have to read as much as you can find about it. I mean, I've got all these sources right here. I've got a book, I've got stuff on the internet, um, old clippings from 1870s,
Wow.
Yeah.
and earlier, and you have to take it all in and then try to write it right.
Yeah.
Write it in your own voice.
Do you still use a microfiche to read sources?
No, not unless I have to. I haven't had to do that in years. There's this great book I found. I think somebody at the library back home told me about it, but it's just like a book that was written, a history of the county by where during the Depression, there was this thing that Roosevelt did called the Works Progress Administration, and they did a lot of our federal parks were built by people who were unemployed, giving them employment, and they hired unemployed writers, like really good writers, to go out. There's no byline on this book, but it's beautifully written, published in the 40s. So like that's a big source, but also I've interviewed local historians and I've been to the historical society. I take a lot of pictures of things. Like I have a folder of my Urbana history, and I have clippings that the historical society or the library saved about these events I'm writing about.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You mentioned a very strict editor. When you have a new idea for a book, does it spring up on you, or do you ruminate on the idea for a while before you really solidify it and present it to your editor?
It depends. First, I have the tough person I mentioned was my agent. So like that's the person that's going to sell your book to the editors, or ideally a bunch of editors, to try to get a bidding war, right? So you can get a better advance, so you can write a better book because you'll have more time. And so Dopesick was a book I wanted to write as my second book, but I couldn't get. This was back in 2013. I couldn't convince my agent or my editor that there was a heroin epidemic going on in New York because they were living in these little yuppie bubbles, right? And y'all saw it, I saw it, but they didn't see it. So then once we found out that we were actually losing life expectancy largely because of the opioid crisis, then I went back, and Dreamland had already come out. And so I was able to sell Dopesick as the story of kind of how the families were doing. Dreamland had been largely about the cartels. And I mentioned the drug dealers in Dopesick. I have one of my main characters is a drug dealer, but mostly it's about the victims and the families that are left to try to clean up the mess that the pharma companies made and the war on drugs.
Upon graduating college, what was your decision process like to decide to come to Roanoke and write for the Roanoke Times?
Yeah, when I got out of college, I worked in Columbus, Ohio. I worked for like the monthly magazine. I was just an intern. And then I went to work they had a series of weekly newspapers. The magazine did that covered the suburbs. So that's where I learned how to cover like cops and courts and school board meetings and stuff. And I remember like one of my kind of extra assignments one week was to write a feature story about this historic downtown Columbus theater they were redeveloping. And the guy who was in charge of it was so excited. And I just had this like flash of an aha moment that like I could be excited as he is, in that I'm writing about his excitement and what's going on with this. And it was just like the first time everything like with the feature story clicked. And then I kind of thought, well, I want to do that. And then for my next job, it was in Savannah, Georgia. I worked for the Savannah News Press, and I just wrote feature stories. And then when it came to Roanoke, I didn't even know where Roanoke was on the map, honestly.
Yeah.
But they wanted to fly me up for an interview, and I was like, okay. And I just fell in love. And it's, Appalachia, it just feels like home right away. It feels like home way more than my hometown feels like home. This is home. Yeah.
Speaking of the Roanoke Times,
Yeah.
we've actually interviewed Walter Rugaber.
Oh, you're kidding! I love him.
Yeah, he came on.
Yeah,
so he came on the podcast a few months ago. He was great.
Yeah,
it was great.
Oh, I bet. Such a classy man, and what a career!
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. Very.
Did he talk about covering civil rights and Watergate?
Yeah. So he was extremely interesting.
We sat down with him for 2 hours and longer. Just the recording was 2 hours, and he just
absolutely
told us everything.
Oh my gosh! Will you send that to me?
Yeah, I will.
Yeah. I love history, and I think I know a lot about history. He blew me out of the water. He knew so much more.
He was on the front lines. I mean, he was. Yeah. Was he at He was at some of the key events. Civil rights.
Yeah. He told us that he had met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah. How him and his family, they hung out together at events, town events and stuff. Right. So it was extremely good interview. But he talked about you a little bit too.
Oh, he did. That's nice.
Yeah, he mentioned you. So
we just thought we would mention him, and I don't know. We figured that you knew him. But
I actually did. I did a story about him when he retired, and I was always very intimidated by him. I mean, not that he was intimidating; he was very nice, but I just he was like a giant in my world.
Right.
Yeah.
We actually saw that newspaper. I think every story was about him on the front cover in various ways. So I think he has it hanging up in his house. That's where we did the interview at.
Did you go to his house?
Yeah,
really
we did.
Cool. Really cool.
It is beautiful.
it was very neat.
Yeah.
So do you guys always do writers?
Not
No.
exclusively. No, we've done politicians. We did Congressman Morgan Griffith. We did a sheriff,
Local politicians, and just people from around town. We'll
Yeah.
do anybody.
Yeah.
Local people. We've done everybody from my aunt to Ethan's dad
Yeah.
to politicians to the Congress attorney. So anybody that's willing to come on, we'd love to hear their stories. So that's
Yeah.
Right now we're on a bit of a journalism streak where we're interviewing journalists. You being one of them, right, or former journalists or authors, and
Yeah.
we're trying to continue that into the next few months.
Okay.
We just get on different kicks, and but we just like to hear people's stories
Yeah.
and meet new
That's
people
cool.
too. So
Yeah. Well, we should talk.
Yeah.
I might want some ideas for other people for you to interview.
Yeah, that'd
absolutely
be awesome.
We would love it. But yeah, we thought we'd bring up the Roanoke Times because we've actually had some experience with that.
Right.
So you come to Roanoke and you said Appalachia feels like home. What was that transition like for kind of getting acclimated here?
Well, it really wasn't. It just felt like home. Like the first time I went to Kroger, I go to the checkout and the woman picks up my mushrooms. She goes, "What are you going to fix with this?" And it just felt really warm, and people are really nice here. Like they're chattier than they are in the Midwest. In the Midwest, people aren't very loquacious, where I'm from. And I was kind of a extrovert outlier in my family of pretty quiet people. And I just, and I also didn't hurt that I met my husband right away, and the paper was really good back then. I'm sure if you interviewed Walter, I'm sure you know about that. It was Pulitzer finalist 3 years in a row. Multiple national awards. I worked on a project that won an international award. I mean, it was good. And then when I was about 40 or early 40s, the paper brought in this really tough managing editor, and I was on the team that hired her. Her name's Carol Tarrant, and it had been the editing had been slack until she came for a while, and she really upped my game. Like she would return stories to me with red ink all over them, and make me cry at least once per project, and things I had. Summary writing I was telling you about, that's so hard for me sometimes, where you're trying to put tons of different sources into your own voice and still be citing and whatnot. She would just exit out like it was nothing, but she really made me next level. And then that encouraged me. I did so good with her, working and partner with her, and the photographer I used to work with a lot too really was game on all the time, named Josh Meltzer, and he shoots the photos for my books. That gave me the encouragement to apply for a Nieman Fellowship at Harvard, which I had in 2009 and 10. And then when I got there, you're like in this program with 23 journalists from all over the world, and they're like at the top of their game. And here I am from Little Roanoke, Virginia. I was the only one from a small town or small city. It's not a small town. And I realized they weren't any better than me per se. I mean, the thing people had in common is they really cared and they really worked hard. And so when I came back, the first assignment I had that was like a project, it was from Carol, and in the last furniture factory in Stanleytown, Virginia. Stanley Furniture had just gone out of business. 600 people lost their jobs. And they had sent a business reporter down to write a story about how sad that was. But she said, when you get back, I want you to do a deeper story, a story that gets at how we're all complicit when we buy stuff made in China and Mexico, et cetera. Because we want that cheaper thing, and how this basically capitalistic system of offshoring, where corporations were chasing cheaper wages has maybe been good overall for the American consumer. Prices maybe went down a little bit, but way more people have been hurt by that, who have lost their jobs, and entire towns are like, ghost towns now. And I didn't see all that at the beginning. I just thought, well, I'm going to go down to Bassett and Martinsville and Henry County, which at the time had the highest unemployment rate in the state for over a decade. So that was kind of my in. Like, how has this, all these closings, changed the town? And because newspapers would cover these blips, these closings, blah blah blah, nobody ever had tallied it up. Nobody had looked at, like, what's that look like on the ground? Well, it looks like food stamps tripled. It looks like disability rates went up 64%. Crime on a level never before seen. And then that's what told me about the heroin epidemic. At the tail end of my book, you have people like approaching strangers outside of CVS because they want them to go buy pseudoephedrine so they can make meth, or you have an abandoned furniture factory set on fire accidentally by an opioid addicted person who's stealing copper wires out of the factory and inadvertently sets an abandoned building on fire. And it was so much richer than I knew. And I realized, like, nobody in the cities understands, really, when you look at what happened in these small towns. I'm telling you guys, you're from one of those small towns. So what the pharma companies did when they targeted those areas because people had a lot of workplace injuries because they've been working in factories and coal mines and logging and mining and fishing. And they sent their reps, they hired an army of sales reps, and Purdue sends their reps into these places. And suddenly there are pill mills everywhere. I forget how many were in Mount Airy, but there were a ton of pill mills there at the heyday. In any place where there was lots of opioid prescribing, there were also lots of job losses. And people quickly realized that maybe they couldn't pay their rent on their unemployment or their little part-time job. But if they got their doctor to prescribe them Oxy, they could take half, sell the other half for an 80 milligram went for $80. I mean, that was a good old fashioned side hustle, right? Like, not unlike moonshine in the past. So it became a way to stave off being dopesick, but also just a way to earn a living.
My dad had told me that all three books, Factory Man, Dopesick, and Raising Lazarus, kind of tie into each other. And I wasn't sure what he had meant because I hadn't gotten an opportunity to read Factory Man and Raising Lazarus yet. But I understand now. They really do because
They really do. And then the book I'm writing now, which is my personal story and also the story of how my town has changed, it's very much in line because it's about polarization too. And I mean, these folks are angry. They're angry about, they're mistrustful of the government. I mean, I can't tell you how many people are homeschooling their kids, homeschooling in quotes, like, or not sending their kids to school. This kid I'm following is a child of the opioid crisis. And I didn't want to I'm not writing a third opioid book, but I can't not mention it because it is huge. That and methamphetamine.
We live in Carroll County, and it's really strange to see, especially reading Dopesick, see places that you recognize,
right,
or like places that are not 5 minutes away from us that are mentioned in the book. So it really does. It's like, huh.
Yeah.
And I think people who live here reading the book will get a much more, I don't know, be able to connect with it on a much deeper level.
Right. You'll see the celebrities that leave awesome reviews on the book, and it's good that bigger names are reading your book, people who aren't from around here. But I really think that, like, all my teachers have read it. A lot of students at the high school have read it. People who are from the area that read it really benefit more from it, I think.
Oh, that's nice. That's nice. Well, Raising Lazarus is even more from the area. Um, a lot of it takes place in Mount Airy and Surrey County and Carroll County. Speaking of Carroll County, have you interviewed the great Ralph Barrier Jr.?
Mm-mm.
We have not.
No,
No.
man.
Have you heard of Barrier Orchards?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, so that's his family. He grew up there. He was my colleague at the Roanoke Times, but he um, he wrote a great book. You might want to interview him called "If Trouble Don't Kill Me," and it's the true story of his granddad and his twin brother, who were these like kick butt country music celebrities, and then until World War II happened, and then they both got sent to different parts of the world, and it kind of all fell apart. But it's a beautiful book about Carroll County. It's just beautiful. They grew up on um, in the holler. I forget
Cana?
what it's called. That's where Ralph's from.
Right.
But so Ralph had written a book before I even had the idea to write a book. I was writing that series I was talking about that led to Factory Man, and I said, I think I've got a book here. And he said, I think you do too. And he said, you got to write a proposal. I was like, I don't want to write a proposal. That'll take forever. He goes, I wrote a proposal with an infant baby in the house while working full time. And I was like, Ralphie ain't going to make me feel lazy. And I went home and I just did it. You know, that thing I was telling you about the Neiman Fellowship, like everybody just works hard. So like I set my alarm early and I worked all that week, but before work and after work, I worked on the book proposal and it was done by Friday. I
Wow.
wrote
Yeah.
it in 1 week. I mean, did I have to rewrite it after I got my agent? Yes. But like bones of it were finished. And it's like, sometimes you just need a kick in the pants.
Can you talk about the structure of a book proposal
Um,
as someone who's not from in the industry?
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, different people do it different ways. You can look online and it'll say like, you know, really ring their bell at the beginning, draw them into the story, then jump back and say, talk about what the book's going to be about, and then give a marketing section on who's going to buy it and how, and then do a section on you and why you're the person to write this book and how many followers you have on Twitter or whatever. I don't, I'm, and then you often have to write a sample chapter. I didn't do that. My first agent didn't have me do that. He just like was like, you got to write the hell out of this. I want the editor to pick me up, pick the phone up and call me like when they're finished. And so we worked and worked and worked. And I even, he even paired me up with a friend of his who was a writer, and he helped me with the proposal. And then once you've written a book, the first proposal might be, say, 50 pages. The second one, if it does well, it doesn't have to be as long because, like, you don't need to write about you because ideally they know who you are and whatever. So the proposals have gotten shorter for each project. But, I mean, still pretty long, maybe 25 pages.
So you were writing for the Roanoke Times. Did you have any favorite pieces there before you moved on to writing books full time?
Well, the one I told you about, Selena, the young woman raised by the library and the single mom who's now a librarian, that's definitely my favorite story I've ever done. And then the Factory Man story is just fun because the main character is a pain, but he's also like super interesting, super challenging, super funny. Like my husband will always know when I was talking to him on the phone because I'd just be laughing, laughing, laughing. So, I mean, some of the stuff he said, like you just couldn't make it up. And
You mentioned in an interview that he was annoying and in your face.
oh,
That's how
totally.
he's just
Yeah, and
he was
he would
him.
call all the time. Sometimes he would call 8 times a day. And if I'd be at my desk writing, I don't know why I did this. Just like the first time it caught me off guard, and I said, I'll send myself an email. So I write my name in the email, and then I would take the notes in the bottom of the email. And at the end, I'd write JB3, short for John Bassett III, the date, and then a few keywords. And then I would pull it over into a folder. So all those emails in one place. And one time I accidentally sent the notes to him instead.
Oh,
Yeah.
Instead of writing my email, I put his in. And like 5 minutes later, the phone rang and he goes, Beth, are you recording me? And I said, I'm not recording. I said, I record you when I'm with you, but I'm just typing when we're on the phone. I said, I'm a reporter doing a book on you. He said, because I just got an email from you where you wrote down everything I said, including my dirty jokes. And I was like, that's right. That's right. That's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to use those dirty jokes.
I got to hear him give a graduation speech, and it was really good, though. He did a good job with it.
He's
This is
really
2
good.
years ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Where was that?
at Galax High School.
Oh, great.
Yeah. So I had some family graduating, so he did the commencement speech for that. It was good.
He's a really good speaker.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about Galax? Because that's where me and Nathan live. I live even closer. I live probably 3 or 4 minutes from Galax.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the area just a little bit? Your experience with it?
Yeah. I mean, the friendliest people in the world. They talk like Jamie, really, really fast. You might not do. I remember the first time I drove through the McDonald's. Where it's got that double line, the McDonald's drive-through.
Yeah, it does.
You know what I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm.
And I'd never seen one with 2 like that at the time. And I was like, I was probably on my way home, and it was late in the day, and I'm sure I was getting a Diet Coke and maybe some French fries. But like, I remember calling my husband and saying, I just went through the drive-through at McDonald's. It was a double line, and I had no idea what the other person was saying. Because I remember she'd be like, I was like, sorry? And I just literally could not understand what she was saying. And then, it was 2:39 or whatever. But just the friendliest people in the world. And, I spent more time in Bassett because I was writing about the people left behind, right?
Right.
Like,
yeah.
Because that's where John was from originally, John Bassett from Bassett. And then he had ended up in Galax in the 80s. But I was really writing about the impact of globalization. So it was important to really cast my net wide over in the places where the jobs went away. At the same time, I'm writing about this kind of hero figure over in Galax. I'm also, writing a bit about the town too. And, every time I would go, I forget where he has lunch every day. This little diner, not far from the McDonald's on the other side of the street.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. Briar Patch?
No. County Line?
Yes, the county line. He goes to the county line every day. He gets like a chef salad. And one time he was there, and his son called me after lunch. He goes, guess who was at the county line today? And I was like, I don't know. You and your dad. He's like, yeah, but guess who else? Zach Galifianakis. Did you know he
lives? Yeah. I think it's Sparta. He lives.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I saw a really powerful photo in Bassett when the dam had broke and it flooded the town. Can you talk a little bit about how the flood affected the area?
In the 30s?
Yeah.
Well, John Bassett was born during that flood.
Right.
And so that was a really cool example of, like, he was born at this really dramatic moment for the town. I mean, cows were floating down the Smith River.
Yeah, right. The picture, it was like knee high almost.
That one where the factory workers are standing in the water or something.
Yes,
yeah, I love that photo. I hadn't thought about that in a long time. But what I liked about that, it was like the opening of a chapter where I was going to, I had already established who John was, a little bit about Bassett, but then I was going to go deep into the history. And so I wrote about the circumstances of his birth, which were this huge storm and this flood, and everybody thought the world was ending, blah, blah, blah. Of course, they rebuilt. But just sort of using the geography, explaining the geography, and how the reason the factories are there is because there was timber in the hillsides, in the mountains, it's in the foothills. And there was free lumber, as they say in Bassett. And they would use the river to float the logs down to the factories. I mean, the first factory was built on the Smith River, on the banks of the Smith River. Well, they all were. All the Bassett factories were on the Smith River. And Bassett's this really long, linear town. It's mostly the factories and houses, but it's really long and narrow. It inside the ridge of the mountains. And so I love that when you can blend like a personal story, you know, the dramatic story of, I forget the details of how far the chauffeur had to drive his mom to deliver the baby. But you can also write about like the fact that, you know, he was born to inherit that company, which at the time was on its way to being the largest furniture maker in the world. And he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and he had no intention of taking it out, as he likes to say. And he was going to do big things, even though like all these things were standing in front of him. He didn't know it yet, but it was a way to kind of tease the reader that he was born at this momentous occasion of this flood, but like it's going down with this guy. And sure enough it does. And so you're trying to build the narrative of what's going to happen to this town. And the reason Bassett is even there is because they had, you know, furniture making had been in Western Michigan and New York. And Mr. Bassett, his grandfather, who opened Bassett Furniture in 1902, had the idea. He was selling lumber at the time. He had the idea, or his wife did, that they could employ people, start their own factory instead of shipping the wood north, start their own factory, and they'd make more money because they could pay the former slaves and people who had been working sharecropping. They wanted to join the cash economy. They wanted cash money, and they could pay them less than they would have to than the people in New York and Michigan were paying. And it's exactly what happened to them a century later when China and Vietnam came along. So that, you know, there's the irony you can start to build up too. So at the moment I'm writing, like, as John's born, his grandfather's got maybe 3 of the eventual, I don't know, he had 11 plants at one point in multiple states, or the company did. But at the time, they're like these scrappy upstarts stealing furniture making from the North, and they had an advantage over North Carolina, even though that was a big furniture making district, because that was Jim Crow era, and the North Carolina furniture owners wouldn't hire black people. And Bassett did. You could say, oh, that was good that he did, and it was good, but he paid him half of what he paid the whites. Right. So it's all so complicated, and I love that.
You went back to school and you got a master's in creative writing. Can you talk about going back to school after already having a career under you?
Actually, I was really early in my career when I did that. That was 1993 and 4. I was only like 28.
But still, you had multiple years of experience under you, and you knew what you were doing to some degree.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, to be honest, I don't think I've ever said this, but I really wanted to break. Newspaper writing's really hard. People will say, like, well, writing books is such a bigger deal than writing newspapers. Well, I never worked as hard as when I wrote for a newspaper. Like, that's just hard work. You write a big old project, spend weeks on it, and it runs on Sunday. Maybe it runs Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday if it's a big deal. And on Wednesday, they want something else. You know, it's like with this, at least I get to go out and talk about it for a year or two. You know, I'm still talking about Dopesick. I'm still out speaking about Dopesick and Lazarus 5 years after Dopesick came out, almost 6. And I mean, it's part of how I make my living, speaking, which is shocking to me. But it's cool because, like, I didn't think I was going to write a second book about the opioid crisis, but that's where I got the idea to do that, because as I was out speaking about Dopesick, I started hearing about good things that were happening, and they were happening in unexpected places like Mount Airy, and you know, and there was all these threads because I had already written about Mount Airy and Factory Man, so I knew it a little bit, and and there was this connection with globalization. So my master's degree at Hollins was in fiction, but I did study. I had one independent study both semesters. It was only a year-long program then, with Richard Dillard, who recently passed away, and he was just a phenomenal professor, and it's really.
Do you think that you'll write a fiction piece in the future?
Nah.
Yeah.
No interest. I mean, I'm not very good at it. By the end of the year, I was finally starting to get the hang of it, but everything I wrote was like kind of based on real things. You know what I mean? Which a lot of fiction writers do, but I'm just I just don't have that gift.
Did you choose Hollins just for its location and proximity, or did you kind of have it
Yeah,
specifically in
I
mind?
mean, yeah, I wouldn't have been able to leave, I don't think, because I still worked some, even when I was off that year. I worked part time, and I just bought our first house, and we're gonna have kids soon, and it was just this opportunity. I thought I can get a year of like really studying writing, and my friend Mary Bishop, who worked at the paper and had won a Pulitzer and was kind of a mentor and inspiration to me. She had done the program and really loved it. And she said, it'll teach you how to think. And I don't know that it did, but it was a good program.
You mentioned Dopesick and how you're still pushing that. What was the process like for having that made into a mini series on Hulu with, I think it was Michael Keaton,
Yeah,
the Dopesick series? Can you talk about that a little bit?
sure. It was better than I ever imagined, largely because the showrunner and creator, Danny Strong, is just a really sweet guy. And there was my TV agent made my deal contingent on me being in the writer's room. So I was like, literally, it was me and four other writers and Danny and some assistants working on the storylines for every episode. And at the beginning, I was kind of like, this is my material. I was kind of like talking too much. And at one point, he said, Beth, you're being too literal. We'll take care of that with a cut. And I realized, oh, this is a whole new kind of form of writing. I need to just chill and listen for a while. So, I mean, I did end up co-writing 2 episodes but, and it was really fun. But I mean, what an honor that somebody took my story, created something totally different out of it. Uh, I mean, it's so much different than the book. It's really basically the first third of the book with a little bit at the end. Um, but he made it into this kind of procedural drama that's super interesting, but that is going to reach way more people than my book reached because people don't read, sadly, as much as they watch TV. And, we had people calling us saying, you know, I called my addicted son for the first time in 3 years after I saw your show because I only now figured out like who the real criminals are. It's not my son. It's the people who did this to him. And so that it could begin to break the stigma, which so many of the problems still are under the umbrella of like, oh, stigma is why we incarcerate rather than treat people. It's stigma. It's the war on drugs. It's blah, blah, blah. So that was really exciting. And also my other goal going in was that we not stereotype Appalachia. And,
Yes.
um, and I've heard nothing but good things from
Yeah.
the Appalachians I know about it. So most people have really appreciated that. And seeing like I get Facebook messages, Instagram, Twitter messages all the time from people who have just now read it. And one woman like a month ago, she realized, she said, I don't have to feel all alone. It's like she was so ashamed of her, I think it was daughter, and she was just suffering in silence that she literally, I don't know whether she didn't read the news or anything, but like not until somebody gave her Dopesick did she understand that she wasn't totally alone, which is so sad. But she's reaching out to me with this note of gratitude, like, thank you so much. What should I? And I was like, well, there's a follow-up book called Raising Lazarus. It's all about solutions. I just happen to have also written that. And that feels really good. But the show brought it to a whole next level of audience engagement, which was cool. Plus, like, Batman's in it. I mean, how cool is that?
Did you get to meet him personally? Or?
Yeah, yeah. Really, really great. I only got to go on set once because of COVID. You had to have like all these multiple tests for 3 days in a row. And I was on deadline with the new book. So when they were shooting, but I have a little bitty part in episode 3. And so I went those days that one time for my little bitty part that Danny kind of dared me to do. Um, and it was really cool because I got to see all the sets and like the inside of the coal mine, which is just inside of some like industrial warehouse outside of Richmond. They made it into the interior of the coal mine. It was just the inside of Richard Sackler's office and his window. And on the outside of the window, which is still inside the warehouse, there was a big curtain with a photograph of Stamford, Connecticut. Like just all these little tricks you don't think about, like just seeing the wardrobe, there'd be a whole line of all the things Richard Sackler's wearing in the show or all the things Michael Keaton's character is wearing. It's just like it was really fascinating.
What advice do you have to younger people who want to pursue journalism as a career? What would you tell them that you wish you knew 30, 40 years ago?
Like you own your career. Like if you're bored, maybe you're boring. If you're going to go into journalism, which has been decimated, you're going to have to work really, really hard to you set yourself apart. You're going to have to learn new online skills. I mean, you're going to be competing with AI and everything else. Like it's a whole new world. So there's not going to be very many jobs in it. But there's always room in many different kinds of areas for writing and writing adjacent careers. So, I mean, I'm not sure if it was my kid that I would advise majoring in journalism. I mean, which is sad to me to say. And I feel like I got out at just the lucky moment because the industry, I mean, 2 newspapers fold every week. It's kind of shocking.
We actually just got to interview our local newspaper.
Yeah,
So
Mr.
that was
Alan Worrell.
Alan Worrell from the Carroll News. So it was interesting to see that perspective from a small town newspaper too.
And it used to be a lot bigger than it is now. And you can even say that about the Roanoke Times too. It used to be
Totally.
just ginormous. And now don't get me wrong, it's a big newspaper still, but
it's not.
it's smaller.
Yeah.
And
It's so small. I mean, there were 125 people just in our newsroom when I came in 1989, and now there's about 12.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
The Carroll News used to be 8 people, and now it's 2.
So
It's
it is sad.
But it's sad because we don't even know what we're missing, right? We don't even know what
Right.
stories we're not getting.
I have 2 questions to finish it out.
Okay.
Where do you see yourself in 10 years?
Hopefully retired. Maybe writing a piece every now and then. I'm going to be 60 this year. I'll probably never stop writing. Because I grew up poor, I always have this thing where like, oh my God, if this book doesn't do well, I might be a bag lady again. And my husband said, Beth, you were never a bag lady. And, there's just this something about like my engine just hums a little higher than a normal person's. And I don't not work very well. But lately I've started thinking about, I'm going to be 60 this year. Maybe I should start at least planning to retire.
Yeah.
I'll probably always write. Yeah.
And my next question kind of runs along the same vein as Ethan's, but it's a little bit different. What advice do you have for just a young person making their way in the world? Not specifically journalism, but just anything.
Yeah. Put phone down. As much as you can, like get out into the world, get out into nature. Try to have a balance in your life that doesn't just involve screens. They say like, I see it with my own kids. It's just like, you miss so much when you're just like face plastered to a screen. And it's not making people happier. It might make things quicker. It's not making anyone happier. Do I use my phone all the time? Yes. Am I at a computer right now? Yes. But, they say social media is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Like it's really bad for you. It's important to get out in the world and talk to people in their face. So I know that sounds like old lady doesn't know what time it is, but that's what time it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
And our last question is a bit of a cliche, but
a bit of a doozy too. We ask everyone that we interview this.
Yeah, but we believe that it's indicative of a person's true character, and that is, what is the meaning of life to you?
Do good.
Yeah.
Do good. Have fun. Get outside. Be nice. Just be nice. Okay. Last story I'll tell.
Okay.
I was at this. I was at speaking at a writing festival on Martha's Vineyard like 6 years ago, and I was at this dinner party the night before with, I think there were 4 people with Pulitzers in the room. It was like they were all like mega best-selling writers. Ann Patchett was there. Geraldine Brooks was there. Richard Russo was there. Amor Tolls was there. We were at his house. And some of the folks were complaining about book tour. And they were saying, oh, you just, it's one night here, one night here, and you're just so exhausted and you're talking to people and you love it, but it's so exhausting. And then you get in your taxi to go back to your hotel, and then the taxi driver wants to know why you're in town. And Geraldine, Pulitzer winner, amazing human being, she said, no, be nice to everybody. And I was just like, she's got it. She's got it. And they weren't really being mean. It was just a group of people.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
But
Absolutely.
she's right. When Jamie Edwards' son wants you to go on his podcast that he does with his friend, you do it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
It means a lot to us.
Yeah.
All right, you guys. Well,
Yeah.
best wishes.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you. It's been an
Thank
honor
you.
to speak with you.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
We've really
it's
enjoyed
been
it.
an honor.